Today is September 7th. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki, Naganago Mako Che Chestakomaki, or Dekots Nagotine Siku. Hi, my name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. I'm speaking to you on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed US-Canadian border are the Blackfeet. North of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bagani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw Nation of the Stoney Nation, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina Nation. I acknowledge all First Nation, Metis, Inuit, status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. Here in Calgary, it's Pride, and it's important for folks to understand that the straight agenda and gendered violence was and is forced on these lands by Christian outsiders. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, honoring the host as a guest, honoring your role, acknowledging your role as a treaty partner in a so-called time of reconciliation. And I'm going to add, it is crystal clear to me, people don't see the importance of it um, as more important before acknowledging your MP, MLA, and city councillor, because you wouldn't have a Canada without it. So treat and honor Indigenous people in land acknowledgements like you would O Canada or God Bless the Queen or whatever it is that you do. You even went to a wedding and we didn't acknowledge the land. It's important your land acknowledgements have meaning. I encourage all people to introduce themselves with acknowledgement of their ancestors, stories of displacement, how you perceive your role as a treaty partner, a citizen of Canada, a refugee, or other land displacement, so we as Indigenous people know how safe you are to be around. If you don't know how to pronounce your local Indigenous nation's name, won't say your pronouns, won't say your story of origin, won't acknowledge stolen lands, won't acknowledge imposed economic oppression, or your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around my community, my family, and myself. Understanding land acknowledgements and their importance is Indigenous 101 because it immediately addresses colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and lies taught today in Canadian schools nationally. That's why settlers and those who call themselves Native Calgarians or whatever town you're from show me you have no Indigenous 101 understanding. Jesse Winte's book Unreconciled on chapter 13 and pages 180 and 181 really explain this perfectly. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11. My people wore rabbit skin, so it's often been referred to the land of the Hare people. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene Nation is a visitor of this area of Clincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot Mohkinstsis, as Michelle Elliott, an English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene, or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. Through my father, I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution, while having a Canadian Indian Act imposed status card. That is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit for the Indigenous 2S LGBTQ plus community and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the Canadian socio-economic ladder because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. As a Dene woman who has attempted to run after joining harmful colonial parties, spent money to be at expensive conventions, left my home to travel to those conventions just to vote on incomplete policies that still allow incarceration, a denial of justice, denial of health services, racism, colonial trauma, and genocide of Indigenous and Black peoples. I have worked to continue reports to advocate for and attempt to work within these systems meant to harm me and my community. I cannot say have a great pride when I know my community is dying from current drug policies, racism in healthcare, Christian-based drug policies, abstinence programming, private healthcare, justice systems built on racist land theft and imposed British constructs that continue genocide on Indigenous people. Right now, a lot of awful things have been happening with a tragedy that's happening nationally. and it's been getting so much attention. And today I was just reading that, not to donate to a bunch of GoFundMe's that are going out there. So I just want people to understand that, we are constantly living through trauma today because of the continued racism. We've given the answers, we've given solutions, and yet there's no political leaders that are non-Indigenous willing to implement them. So I think of those folks harmed today, and I hope we honor their lives. I hope you see your role in the importance of stopping harm, and as a citizen, see your role in reconciliation and treaty. I honor the Blackfoot, and as the elders have been really kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my name in Blackfoot, and Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Satu Dene. My humblest apologies to the Blackfoot and Dene elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation of this entire podcast. Any mistakes or misinterpretations will be on me. I encourage questions so that misunderstandings can be cleared up as soon as possible. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous. I just share my journey as I walk the red road. I've been accused of not being kind while surviving genocide, yet I have given free book clubs, podcasts, info on my social media for years, as have many others, and you can hire me at any point in time to teach you. At this point, it is willful to be ignorant on these issues. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments, questions, or e-transfers. Also, giving a review helps whatever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. So today I am lucky enough to have a friend of mine that I have met over the years at many different Liberal events. Jaro, I would love for you to unmute yourself and introduce yourself in your way to us. We still can't hear you. You're still muted.
I thought I pressed it. Sorry. Hello, everyone. Coming from Treaty 6 lands, Tensei. Anyways, thanks for inviting me, Michelle, onto your show. This is one of my very first interviews, and I definitely am interested in talking about my journey with reconciliation, which began around 2009, when I decided that I needed to start, just looking up who I was, and I did at that point. I really didn't know much about myself, where I was from. I didn't know much about my Indigenous Métis culture, and so that's where I would say my journey began. At a family reunion, I started asking family members about our family history, and I was surprised when they told us that I was Métis. At that point, I really had no understanding of Métis, my Métis culture. So that's kind of where it all began, and um, so I went on a journey, and this is where I am today. Obviously, that journey has led me towards the Liberal Party, who I feel is more understanding party. They're not perfect, but they, I believe, at least they have compassion, and they have helped promote the culture, Indigenous and Métis and others. So therefore, for me, I grew up in Alberta as well. I was born in Calgary, and my family has been in Alberta from the very beginning, since my great grandfather Joseph Cardinal and Lizette Frobisher moved here to help build the fur trade. So I've been here family's been here from the very beginning. Plus, my Cree history goes back who knows how many thousands of years. So the thing is that I now, I'm on that journey as you described, and hoping to continue forward and see where it takes me.
That's great. How has your family been? How are they supportive?
Yeah, my family very supportive. My wife is supportive of Indigenous culture. My children, they love uh, being Métis. We've been going to a lot of Métis events. They're very proud to be Métis, which is a lot different than how I grew up because when I grew up I went to school, there was a lot of more open racism. Now it's kind of hidden, but it was more open against Indigenous people. So a lot of people were scared to even say they were Indigenous, especially Métis people. Métis people, they would hide it because they didn't want people to know that they were, Indigenous in any way. So growing up, yeah, the racism was more direct and right out in the open. And today now, it's like I said, it's hidden. But at least one thing I can say is that my children grew up uh, from a very young age understanding that Indigenous culture is not only a beautiful culture, but so is the Métis culture. So
Yeah.
um, I've always taught them that there's an incredible amount of things that are good about the culture, and they uh, they now view it that way, which is opposite to how I was raised. I was, like I said, I was raised, that it was. I don't even want to repeat all the things that I was told growing up. Honestly,
But I do think it's important to recognize it because you and I both grew up in this environment of absolute awful racism. And of course, I've experienced sexism as a result of it too. So, racism and sexism, and growing up here, really coming to just accept it, which is not okay and shouldn't be okay. But that was the reality. And when Christiana Freeland was accosted in Grand Prairie, I was like laughing. I'm like, you guys recognize every woman in Alberta is mistreated by men and sworn at and told they're cunts and all these awful other derogatory terms because we're women in Alberta. Like that's not okay. Internalized sexism and racism is not okay. But I mean, the end of the day, I'm just incredibly used to it because that is the atmosphere here.
yeah, it growing up in Alberta, you're subjected to right wing politics and narratives, and you're subjugated by Christianity. So yeah, they have some some interesting belief systems that that are patriarchal, and of course, we all know that women are more powerful than men, and that we should have respect for them, which I don't believe, in my view, Christianity necessarily promotes.
Yeah.
Growing up Christian, I know it very well. I grew up and going to church, and honestly, a lot. I think that a lot of the world's problems are honestly created from religion, especially patriarchal religion. So I'm personally non-religious at this point. I believe in the laws of the universe, which are you could naturally occurring in nature or natural law. And the reason I believe in natural law is because it's just so apparent, right? You don't need to read a book to understand natural law. You just observe the creation, and you'll see that there's actually laws that exist within nature. And the one most important law to me that I've discovered, like every other Indigenous person, is that we're here to learn to find balance in everything that we do,
Yeah, I
and
agree.
that's very good. That's the part that I really like, right?
Yeah.
So you can't if you're trying to be balanced, that's a very tough thing to do. But I don't think misogyny fits in that category of balance. So
Yeah.
it's sad what happened to Christia Freeland that day.
Yeah, it is, but like she had this really wicked response to how she doesn't really like she's had thousands of more welcomes than she's had the one guy, right? But for folks who are interested, The Importance of Monogamy, a book by Sarah Carter, is such a great book at explaining how patriarchy and Christianity was forced on these lands in order to create the Alberta we have today. So I highly recommend it. And it talks about the erasure of Indigenous people and you know, LGBTQ2 plus that was understood in all of the nations, etc. So and I guess, Jaro, I would love to ask you because you and I are liberals, and you've already said that, you know, it shows compassion. To me, it was the Indigenous Peoples Commission. I had reached out to the NDP, and at that time, nationally, this would have been, I don't know, 2011, it wasn't functioning. So Chad Cowie, a former chair, and at that time it was called the Aboriginal Peoples Commission, he was really welcoming to me and really encouraged me to submit policies that were Indigenous based. And they passed, and that's why I ended up going to Montreal in 2014 to promote those policies that I was able to get going. So I wanted to ask you, like, would you be interested in doing more with the Indigenous Peoples Commission?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anything that's going to help promote reconciliation. You know, I feel that right now, many Indigenous people are not very politically active. And I feel that they have given up um, due to the 5 generations of generational trauma and not only that, but being survivors of residential schools. I feel that a lot of people have given up, and the thing is that my goal is to connect to those types of people and help empower them and bring them back and give them a voice. So I would obviously I would love to join the National or Indigenous Commission, whatever. I'm not sure what it's called yet because I'm kind of new to that, but I would love to join that.
Yeah, the
So,
Indigenous Peoples Commission, right?
Indigenous
Because
Peoples
so like,
Commission.
and I'm just gonna lay this out for our listeners as well. Indigenous is an umbrella term for First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. That's an umbrella term. So like, it's more proper to say First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. But the Indigenous Peoples Commission encompasses all of them. And obviously, I always acknowledge non-status because the perpetrated gendered violence that's in the Indian Act has caused my mother to lose her status and finally get it back, me to lose my status and finally get it back, and my daughter was not born with status. And S3 is what is going to give her status back. This has never been a problem for my grandparent or my grandfather, my uncles, or my male cousins. This is only a female issue because of the constant gendered violence. So a lot of this conversation that happens right now about who's a pretend Indian, like there's not a complex, nuanced conversation about is this person actually Indigenous or not, and did they lose their status solely based off of stupid Canadian constructs of the Indian Act. And that's why I'm really clear when I introduce why it is I feel this way and how as Indigenous people we have inherent rights to the land. And like it should be seen as treaty, then prime minister, and you know, MLAs and counselors, but I go to places regularly that they don't understand the importance of land acknowledgements and the importance of recognizing treaty and treaty partners. So, you know, like this is the foundation of our country. And yet it's been purposely not taught through the schools so that people don't see us as important. You're still muted.
Okay, glad. Yeah, one of the things that I discovered going through my family tree And of course, when you try to apply for a Metis status or full status, one of the things you're going to find out is that your life is in shambles. You don't know who you are. You don't know your family history, and you're expected to now go out there and put your family tree together in a very broken up family. And so right from the get go, it's already, you're already behind 1,000%. You know, most Christian families, they already have their family trees laid out there, their photos, everything is organized, and you know, but that isn't the case for Indigenous people. So right from the beginning, I believe that, you know, that's that needs to change. That's almost like, to me, um, you know, if you're really going to say that you want to help Indigenous people heal, part of healing is understanding who they are and where they came from. So I was lucky enough that I was able to finally penetrate my family and find out who I was. And I had to talk to a lot of family members, put the pieces together, and I finally did the genealogy. And that was very difficult. It took me from about 2009 right up to about 2019.
Mm-hmm.
So it took almost 10 years. And that is just, you know, that is way too long
Yeah.
to
Who
find out
has
who
10
you are.
years to devote to that, let alone learn your language, learn your culture that was purposely like when I talk to people about reconciliation, they have no concept of what reclaiming your identity is. And the fact that we are all supposed to identify as Canadians instead of, you know, you're from the Métis Nation, I'm from the Dene Nation, and the understanding of what that means for Canada, you know, and that's why I say like treaty, then prime minister, then you're, you know, like, come on, let's get this right, folks, and people aren't there yet. So, oh, you know, I never really finished that thought about the Indigenous Peoples Commission. Was that it was the only place that was Indigenous specific for policy. And of course, you don't see that in the Conservative Party. And, you know, how can we even kind of be serious about Indigenous issues, reconciliation, solutions, if we're not putting forward that, just like the Women's Commission exists, because if it didn't, then men would just take all the space because that's the way the patriarchy was set up. And lastly, we have the youth and the seniors for the same reason, because they'd be pushed to the side as well if it wasn't for having that space. So that's why I naturally came to the Liberal Party, because they had the Indigenous Peoples Commission. And, you know, and that's why I want to encourage folks to understand the gravity of that, because even to today, when I seen in the last federal election, you know, what people were, their policies, they're not Indigenous specific enough because, you know, they don't have functioning Indigenous Peoples Commissions. And whereas ours has been going since 2006. So, or even before that, I think. Um, you know, so we're quite lucky to have that. And that's why I encourage you to be a part of the IPC in any capacity that you feel comfortable doing.
Yes, absolutely. So I agree with that. Again, um, I would love to join the commission 100%. And then just also, I wanted to just finish up on my comment of my family tree. So, anyways, I also, when I did go through the family tree, I did find out that there was actually a government policy that had, you know, had a very terrible effect on my family, and that was the Hayter Reid Commission. What happened is my family was several family members were in the rebellion of 1885 with Louis Riel, and my grandfather Francois Desjardins, he was a Métis chief, and he signed Treaty 6. And what happened was, because of his participation in the rebellion, which it's not really a rebellion, I should say, it's a resistance. It was a resistance because there was a foreign occupied force on Indigenous land. Even I have to correct myself sometimes because the, you know, his story obviously has indoctrinated me deeply, and I have to undoctrinate myself. But anyways, yeah, so in the resistance of 1885, my family was deemed to be traitors and criminals because we wanted to have our own land on our land. I mean, how treacherous and traitorous is that, right? Anyways, as a result of the Hader Reed Commission, my great grandpa had his chiefdom disbanded, and he was, essentially he was broken. His band was broken up, all because Métis were, they were telling the white ways to the indigenous people. They were telling them, they were cultural brokers, right? And of course, the government at that time didn't like that. They didn't like that somebody could come and tell them, what they were going to do to indigenous people. And that's what Métis people were there to do, is to help them understand. And so they had to, they wanted to stop that. They wanted to break up Métis culture, and they wanted to break up our close connection to indigenous people. And they wanted to end that. So that's how they did it. They came up with a policy. And for 5 generations, my family has felt the effects of that. Whereas, like, if you look at an average farmer who's had 5 generations of land given to them from the very beginning, and prosperity and wealth, and they've passed that forward to their families. So we haven't had anything passed forward. And it's our original land, and that's had a very long effect. So if it took 5 generations of trauma and damage, how long do you think it's going to take to heal, right? It's not going to be instantly. It's a long process for healing. So so to me, it's very important that a lot of people who want to understand indigenous people and Métis people, they understand that, it's not going to happen overnight. It just isn't.
Yeah, and actually, so I've had a book club since 2016, and we've dealt with the different parts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there is a whole book devoted to the Métis and what had happened through Indian residential schools as well. Some really great books that we did for the Métis Nation for understanding. Maria Campbell's, obviously, the Half-Breed book is a really important book. So I really encourage folks to read and understand. And I'm sad that all of the work we did prior to the 215 graves being found, for some reason, just it wasn't resonating until now, the gravity of it. And so we've known for years that tens of thousands of graves are all across the country that are Indigenous. But it was really sad, tens of thousands of Indigenous people telling settlers that, hey, this is a thing, wasn't heard until the graves were found. Now there's a whole conservative movement. And it was an invite only convention that was here in Calgary. And the Dorshire Review, they try to do everything in their power to try to deny those 215 graves proper dignitary, I guess, dignity in death as well. And it's ironic because everybody who is a denier says, well, where are the graves? And I'm like, we literally have a policy, the only municipal policy I know across the country, called the White Goose Flying Report, named after Jack White Goose Flying. And they had to relocate his grave so that IKEA and all of the Glenmore businesses could thrive, be made and thrive, because that's where an industrial school was. So they had to move his grave to the Queen's Park Cemetery just so that they could develop that area into a business. And I mean, this has been a part of our history forever. But then when the TRC came out and the Indigenous, they call themselves the Calgary Aboriginal Committee, they made the White Goose Flying Report to give a municipal lens to the TRC. And I can't understand the denial of our voices, and that's why, of course, we have the podcast, is because my book club is Indigenous led. Indigenous voices speak first. My podcast is Indigenous, and it's not funded by government. So I can, openly say the government, suppressing opinions and ideas and thoughts in different other ways, but not here, because there's no way anybody could fund me, actually. And when I tried originally starting this podcast, there were no funds for things like this. And I don't know if maybe that's changed, but obviously if we've been able to survive this far, I'm going to keep going. But, that is the reality. It is 2022. And the amount of racism, like you were saying, it was, more subtle, hidden racism. I don't know, man. I'm reading the comments of what's happening with this tragedy nationally, and it's pretty open. Those people, that's my favorite racism. Oh, those people.
Yeah, what I meant, a lot of those people that are posting, though, they're anonymous trolls, right? So what I mean is that when I grew up in school, it was more in your face, right? Whereas now it's kind of, they find ingenious ways to hide, especially on social media. Most people won't post racist comments with their actual picture and name, but yeah, around the James Smith Cree stabbings, I had also just made comments like we should support the GoFundMe, who of course was there was $100,000 fund, and all I suggested is that $100,000 is not enough for 10 graves, and of course I got a lot of attacks for that, because I compared it to that what was the name of the bus accident that happened?
The Humboldt.
Yeah, the Humboldt. So I compared it to that, and I just said, if it was, the Humboldt accident had raised $24 million, and I just felt that $100,000 is very insignificant to help families, whereas this is one of the biggest tragedies in Canadian history.
Yeah.
And I just felt that 100,000 wasn't very much, and people were saying that I was comparing the two tragedies, when really I wasn't trying to compare the two tragedies. All I was saying is, can we have the same standard of giving to Indigenous people? Because even when, like you were saying, when Indigenous people want to try to start a business, or Indigenous people want to start a podcast, or they need some type of funding, it just seems that the system out there just, it says one thing, gives us the lip service, but then when it comes time to actually help that Indigenous or Métis person, it just seems that the funds are never there. And it's that really has to change, because if you really want to see how powerful Métis and Indigenous people are, you really need to see, you need to help empower them with finances. And unfortunately, people, that's how the world works. You need money to make things happen. So
Well, I talk about the barriers. Like, first of all, it's a Western imposed economic system. That's first and foremost. There is like imposed barriers through the Indian Act, and you were talking about your family's legacy. I remember the old Beardy Cree Nation was also really persecuted for their aiding in the Métis Rebellion, and these are the reparations of living with shame for, as you said, 5 generations, and not being able to move past a lot of the barriers that were policies purposely put in place to keep you and I from succeeding. And I call it ongoing genocide, because that's what it is. And we're still not there, where the average Canadian can't see themselves as part of this process, even though, as you said, they've had stolen land and it's been passed down from generation to generation, and they still don't see themselves. Now, I actually argue they do. They know, and they don't want to admit it, and they would rather be racist towards you and I than to actually deal with their crap, right? Like, so that's how I perceive it, because I've gotten past the Canadians are good people and they'll do the right thing. I know it, as long as we give them the right solutions, because we have given them the solutions. Our people gave them the solutions in 1990, 6 in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now we have the National Inquiry. And from the types of comments that I'm seeing today about this tragedy that we're experiencing, it's very clear they're not interested in the solutions. The solutions are there. If they want to prevent these types of tragedies, implement these solutions. It's really simple to me.
Yes, I agree. So, you know, I'm glad that the federal government decided that they were going to step up and offer some supports, the mental health supports. They were also going to help with bringing family members from outside. You know, it's good news. So, you know, but honestly, back to the funding of, you know, small podcasts like yours or even social media like mine. It's very, very hard, we're against the odds. So I congratulate you for even having a podcast and for your 30th show. I'm honored to be your guest, and
Oh no,
I
you're my 30th guest this year. I have over hundreds of podcasts.
oh, okay.
I've been downloaded like over tens of thousands of times. That's
Okay.
yeah, no, like I'm not. No,
Your
it's okay.
30th guest this year. Okay,
Yeah.
congratulations on your 30th guest this year.
Yeah.
Um, Again, like I'm not really into the podcast world, but you know, I'm glad that you were able to have success, and I wish you, you know, more success. So, but I would just say if there's anyone out there listening, you know, just consider helping her podcasts. You know, whether it be sharing it on social media, or if you could make a donation, or if there's any way that you can, um, you know, share it with a family member. Just help her get her voice out there, because we need more voices like Michelle's out there in the community, and not only in Canada, because part of healing is people hearing what Métis and Indigenous people have to say, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to mention that provincially, the UCP government has 113 pathways to justice for the missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiry. And yet I have yet to hear any of the leaders that are running for the UCP talk about that or talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They clearly don't understand treaty if they're talking about the Sovereignty Act, even though it's incredibly unconstitutional. And I know you've been talking about that as well.
yeah, one of the reasons why I have a lot of family members that are conservative in Alberta, and you know, growing up in Alberta, you're subjugated to conservative narratives, so you tend to shift that way. Um, but one of the reasons I couldn't be a conservative was when I realized their viewpoints on Métis and Indigenous people. You know, they essentially want us to forget our culture, our history. They want us to forget the fact that, you know, we were the original owners of this land. They want us to just, you know, forget it all, pretend it didn't happen. And the problem is that we can't. When my grandpa signed Treaty 6, he signed a treaty that said he was going to share the land. He didn't sign a treaty saying you own the land. Right? He
Yes,
said
exactly.
you will share. And to this day, there's ceded land and there's unceded land. And the
No, I
thing
would
is,
argue there's no ceded land.
well,
There's zero. It's all stolen land. We signed
yeah,
treaties
it
with
is. You're
good
right. It is.
intention, but they did not sign them with good intention. And they broke
Yeah, you're
treaty
right. You're right.
beforehand because the Indian Act was created in 1876. So they had already broken treaty by creating that. And then when they signed treaty in 1877 here in Treaty 7, they had already signed that treaty knowing they had broke it by passing the Indian Act.
Yeah, definitely. Like when you go to sign an agreement, you definitely don't slaughter all the food sources, which is the buffalo, and you don't, starve people out and stick a gun to their head and say sign a treaty. You're right. I think that most of the Indigenous leaders did it while they were under duress. So I don't think it would honestly hold up in any court if ever it came to that. But what I just meant was that if we were to just like, to me, I mean, I don't want to break up Canada, right? I mean, I I know that there's a lot of people that live here already, and I do realize though that it's Indigenous land. So for me, I just feel there has to be a balanced approach to that, and
I think we all
because
do, but that's about sharing. And right now there
well,
isn't one, right? So
yeah,
Canada has imposed an economic Western system, their laws, and have not worked with us at creating a framework that's mutually beneficial. A lot of the Crown land, especially you up there in Métis Cree land, like why is it Crown land? That's stupid. That should be Creek and Métis controlled land, right? So that there is a way better way for us to work together, and I'm not suggesting we break up Canada. I'm suggesting that Canada, one, have reparations, but two, understand like the average Canadian does not recognize treaty. The average Canadian doesn't understand their role in treaty, and that is the foundation to everything. So until we start getting where there's an understanding of balance, of equal voice, equal revenue sharing, that's when we're getting closer to treaty.
yeah, you're right. Absolutely. I think people don't know that it's our land. They don't understand what the treaty was that our ancestors signed, and they don't understand that to be equal partners, it doesn't involve us, being without land and without stability and mental health and structure and education, which is what we need. We need a level playing field, and we've never had that level playing field. And Métis and Indigenous people are just as hard working as anyone else. We just didn't have the opportunities. We didn't have the credit system. We didn't have the structure, because the structure was broken up of our families. So the thing is that we didn't have some of those things in place, and so now we're just rising out of the ashes, picking up the pieces and putting ourselves back together. And the thing is that we do need land back. Um, Part of the equation of balance is giving a lot of land back, and that's what we need to heal. We need there's like if you were to look at you know the amount of homeless people in Alberta right now, the majority of those are Indigenous people, and you got to ask yourself this: why are Indigenous people homeless on their own land, right? Why are they being evicted by people on their own land? That's pretty disturbing, if you ask me. That there's Métis and Indigenous people living in tents, and they don't have access to home, and there's waiting lists. And you know um, I'm glad that the federal government is trying to get the houses built for they're announcing deals to build houses, but we need we need 100,000 houses built. you
But that's
know
what I mean about reparation. I mean, ultimately, they purposely. So, one of the words that you keep talking about, the family structure falling apart, like literally the policies are still in place to rip our families apart, which is part of the problem, right? Like, until these policies stop, which we're not even close to addressing, which, by the way, you may not know this, but the Indigenous Peoples Commission, we have some, like, we're going through policies right now. So soon there'll be more. I think they're going to stay internal for a little longer, and then soon they'll be public for us to kind of dissect a bit more together. But I can't really discuss them now until they're more public because it's like still internal. Anyway, like the justice system needs reform. it needed reform years ago. We still didn't have access to lawyers until the 90s. You know, like it's, and even today, like I would argue, and I'm sure you and I could both agree that the way Kenny has dismantled the legal system here in Alberta, that we're at a point where legal aid is not even a thing anymore. That our legal aid is on and I would argue it wasn't enough prior to Kenny, right? So like we're still completely at a disadvantage. It's ongoing genocide. These are ongoing policies that are meant to hurt and eliminate us. So until these barriers are stopped, we can't even talk about, you know, finding our family. We can't even talk about that because we're not there yet.
Yeah, systemic racism does exist. It exists in all the laws. All the laws are based,
Yes.
you know, in systemic racism, and it's very hard when you're Indigenous or Métis in Alberta to get any type of justice, because who has access to lawyers and funding? There is no funding. So I mean, if politicians really want to see how much systemic racism really exists, what they need to do is they need to almost provide, you know, proper legal funding to Indigenous people so that we can actually fight for ourselves. Because unfortunately, we don't have law degrees, and we don't have, you know, money from you know, family members passing that down. We don't have wealth. So the thing is that we can't defend ourselves. So we're always going to be in a position of vulnerability because we can't even protect our own interests. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that people don't understand. Whereas when you look at the landowners that have been here for 5 generations, who have passed down the wealth from family member to family member, and now, you know, if they have any injustice, they have a lawyer that they could take some money, give it to him, and he'll defend their interests. Whereas we don't have that ability. So that's one thing that really, if you're really going to fight against systemic racism and injustice, um, Indigenous and Métis people need access to lawyers, and we just don't have that.
Well, and kind of back to your point about the affordable housing, we have systemic underfunding. So, you know, if any municipality or school board was given systemic underfunding, and you know they get at least a 2-year projection, we don't get that. You know, this is the systemic racism that has caused the housing crisis as well, and a lack of health care. Like there's no investment into any aspect of our lives. So we get it at the educational, health, justice, and infrastructure. Like it's all across the board. So, you know, and I would say that obviously, you know, education and health are intrinsically linked with child apprehension as well, and when you have imposed poverty as well, right? So it's the system is designed for us to fail, and until we address the systemic racism, we cannot thrive. So, not that we shouldn't be continuing to try. I know my auntie, she is a lawyer, and she has spent her entire life working for our people. She worked out at the Enoch Cree Nation and Musqueam, Hobima, when it was called Hobima. And you know, she's done Indian residential school claims, helped with real estate, all sorts of things for Indigenous people. And quite frankly, I never got access to any of that because by then we had fallen out of terms, because she had tried really hard when I was a teen to help my mom with a relationship, and I was a stupid teen that was living in systemic racism and sexism, and there hasn't been that bridge building between us for us to really, you know, create conversations after. So, and she's understandably retired and trying to just enjoy her life. So I want her to anyway. So anything else that you want to include? Maybe some contact information. Which social medias do you like to do there, Jaro, so that people can get a hold of you?
Well, what I did was I kind of simplified it. So if you go onto any of my social medias, it's just at Jaro, Jaro Giesbrecht, Giesbrecht. I also put a link, it's called Linktree. And if you click the link tree on any of my social medias, it'll take you to any of my social medias that I have. So you could like, follow, subscribe, retweet, share, or even donate. I have a PayPal link on the top of my link tree. So pretty much any way, if you connect and you're liberal, you're progressive, gay, lesbian, LGBTQ plus, I don't know, I keep forgetting, they keep changing all that. Whatever walk of life, Indigenous, Metis, doesn't matter, as long as you're progressive and you're liberal, and you want to connect, please do.
Yeah, and vice versa. Jaro, if you ever want to talk about Two-Spirit, if you ever want to talk about the land, I never charge my own people for that. I only charge non-Indigenous. So we can connect there. So thank you so much for coming on. You're welcome back anytime, especially if you have something that you're working on that you want to promote. Please don't hesitate. For folks who are my regular listeners, we have our book club coming September 12th. So we're going to be doing the National Inquiry chapters 5 and 6 of volume 1A. October 10th is Res Rules by Clarence Louie. He said he was coming. I can't promise a safe space for this one, folks, but I think so. November 14th, National Inquiry chapter 7 and 8. And then December 12th, we have Standoff by Bruce McIver, who said he was coming. And I encourage anyone who's a settler across this country. Half of my listeners are in Ontario, the other half are in Alberta, with a few in between. I encourage you to join a reconciliation group. If you're in Calgary, we have the Reconciliation Action Group. And I encourage you to start networking between these reconciliation groups, because quite frankly, the fact that the Pope came here and all the churches didn't understand why and weren't working and educating their congregations on why the Pope was coming and being able to name the TRCs like that shows me you don't understand reconciliation. So, if you are setting up your September schedules, make time to learn about Indigenous issues. See your role as a treaty partner, as a citizen on reconciliation. If you're in Alberta and you consider yourself a conservative, you better be pushing that UCP on the 113 pathways to justice. Because if you're not, then that shows me you're no ally to us whatsoever, and you're perfectly okay with the ongoing genocide of gendered violence. I'm proud that this podcast has given solutions and included cultural safety training and cultural first aid in all of them to create a safer space for Indigenous people of color, those with disabilities, and LGBTQ2+ to speak. Thank you, Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fritkin of heretohelp.bc.ca, and giving that What is Indigenous Cultural Safety and Why I Should Care About It link. Their work and those cultural action tools I've said over 100 times in my podcast, so please support Indigenous work like that as part of your reconciliation work and settler understandings. I'm just lucky enough to highlight and repeat them here. Internalized racism or lateral violence is another form of violence Indigenous and marginalized people experience by the structure of racism. It's a lot easier for us to fight each other than it is for us to be fighting structural racism. So that's why you end up seeing that a lot. Do's and don'ts. Oh, you can go to racialequitytools.org. Donna Bevins has a piece about what is internalized racism. So if you identify as a marginalized group, I highly recommend doing this work so that you don't perpetuate any violence against our own people or lateral violence. Do's and don'ts for bystander intervention by American Friends Service Committee. So this is what you do if you see a Muslim woman on the C train being accosted. But yet I've seen a lot of Calgarians still don't know how to do that. If you see or experience racism, you can report it at acttoendracism.ca or text at 587-507-3838 if you're in Alberta. Indigenous have been talking about this issue, sharing our traumas in reports, commissions, and public hearings, just so it'll be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties. Listen to politicians and their policies and platforms. If they don't recognize the marginalized in their budget with Gender Equity Plus, if they're cutting violence prevention programs and services, Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay straight alliances, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities, know that your vote to that party directly negatively impacts marginalized people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. The recommendations of the Royal Commission of the the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the multiple reports about child welfare reform, the yearly multiple reports, and violence prevention, 231 calls to justice, and now provincially, the Kenney government created 113 pathways to justice. So all of you blue voting bootlickers should be holding your blue MLAs to account on this. Municipally, we have the White Goose Flying Report. Denying these reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in the media, education, and justice institutions, with multiple reports that say the same things. Demand change from election platforms and politicians. If they don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, and sexism, they have zero business running. This should be understood by all parties, local politicians, community organizations, sports clubs, etc. A really great article that is out there is how non-Indigenous Canadians become allies, and actually there are multiple ones out there now. If you're experiencing emotional distress after anything we talked about today or because of what's happening right now, there's a First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 1-855-242-3310. They also have a website at hopeforwellness.ca with a little text option. If it's more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, you can call 844-413-6649. It is a national toll-free crisis line for anybody about that. If you're non-Indigenous, there are distress center lines in your area and usually a functioning 211. But you can also call 833-456-4566. And if you're a scooped kid, you can go to ssisa.ca, where they have a whole society for Indigenous people. If you see or experience racism, again, acttoendracism.ca. The following are 2S LGBTQ plus crisis supports available in most areas across Canada. Lifevoice.ca is the one who hosts that. If you want to go there, there's the Trans Lifeline at 877-330-6366. The Trevor Project is the one that kind of does the umbrella. And for youth, 1-866-844-73886. So we have a crisis with drug overdose right now, and that is the government's failure to properly address this. If you know somebody or using a substance, please don't use alone. If you're using alone, there are two apps that you can use. You can download Brave or DORS, and there's also a national overdose response service at 888-688-NORS for support. If you are a First Nation in Alberta, you have access to a Narcan a day. Talk to your pharmacist about it. Every single Albertan has access to naloxone at any drugstore. Please have one on you at all times. Have one in your house and be able to learn how to administer them. They're super easy. So I really encourage that. Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. This is self-care and how I take my power back. This is why I started the podcast, to speak freely, without interruption, without tone police, leadership shaming, gaslighting questions. Many people don't want to hear an Indigenous woman's opinion, but sure want to tell their ignorant one. They know nothing about Indigenous, colonialism, sexism, constant surveillance of Indigenous people, our protests, our vigils, our rights. By the way, Friday, I'll have a sacred fire in my backyard, but in Calgary, there's going to be a vigil for this tragedy that is happening, and likely it'll be completely over policed, like all of our vigils. And if this is news to you, you ain't listening. I and many others share info on microaggressions daily, so it's unacceptable to say them anymore. Learn about being trauma informed. People like me are dealing with internalized racism and gatekeeping that survive off the status quo. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for me, Indigenous peoples, folks with disabilities, QT, BIPOC, and others. Masi Cho to my ancestors. To my granny, to my mom, of what strength looks like through your example. I want to thank my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me a proud culture through her Austrian family and roots, and stepping up to teach me how to be a proud Calgarian. It is through her I'm a second generation. Thank you to my husband, Big Buffalo Rockman, for producing and editing this show. On top of being my husband, childhood friend, father of our child, and support down my journey of the Red Road, he has witnessed decades of sexism and racism. And to our child, Thunderpipe Necklace Woman, we are blessed to learn from you daily, and we are honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. And I hope that my daughter and my family will be proud in the future of us trying to discuss these present day issues. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments, questions, or e-transfers. I also have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe, and go to nativecalgarian.com for anything else, especially if you want to book me. And I want to end by giving side-eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not your dish. And my beautiful cousin would respond, or you'd be in my dish. Thank you so much for listening, folks.